The migration of these people from Anatolia to Britain, it was just a part of a general massive expansion in about 6000 BC that introduced farming into Europe. And before that, Europe was populated by small traveling groups which hunted and gathered. So they gathered up wild plants and they fished for shellfish and hunted wild animals. One group of farmers followed the river Danube up into Central Europe, yet another group traveled west across the Mediterranean. And the DNA reveals that Neolithic Britons were largely descended from groups who took the Mediterranean route, and they hugged the coast and hopped from island to island on boats. And some British groups had a minor amount of ancestry from groups that followed the Danube route. And there's DNA evidence from early British farmers that found that they closely resembled Neolithic people from Iberia, which are mostly in modern Spain and Portugal. And these farmers from Iberia were descended from people who made the journey across the Mediterranean. And they traveled north through France, and they may have entered Britain from the west through Wales or southwest England. And these early Neolithic migrants to Britain have introduced the tradition of building monuments using large stones known as megaliths. And that's Stonehenge, and that's part of the tradition from these people. And when these farmers arrived in about 4000 BC, there were still groups of Western hunter-gatherers, but DNA shows that the two groups didn't really mix very much. And these Neolithic farmers completely replaced British hunter-gatherers, apart from one group in Western Scotland where the Neolithic inhabitants had elevated local ancestry, and that could have come down to the farmers group simply having greater numbers than the others. Dr. Tom Booth, who is a specialist in ancient DNA from the Natural History Museum in London, said, "We don't find any detectable evidence at all for the local British Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in the Neolithic farmers after they arrive." That doesn't mean they don't mix at all. It just means that maybe their population sizes were too small to have left any kind of genetic legacy. And these Neolithic farmers had probably had to adapt their practices to different climatic conditions as they moved across Europe. But by the time they reached Britain, they were already tooled up and well prepared for growing crops in a northwest European climate. And they also analyzed DNA from hunter-gatherers at that time. One of those skeletons was dubbed Cheddar Man, whose skeletal remains had been dated to around 7100 BC. He was the study of a reconstruction unveiled at the National History Museum last year, and if the DNA is correct, unlike most other European hunter-gatherers at the time, he had dark skin and blue eyes, but the Neolithic farmers were pale-skinned with brown eyes and black or dark brown hair. So the Neolithic people from Iberia brought over the tradition of giant rock structures. So that's where the Stonehenge came from. Mystery solved. They weren't put there by aliens. There's no reason to be contacting outer space to figure out where these things came from. It was from Neolithic people from Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and then they moved to Iberia, and then they reached Britain in about 4000 BC. Those people built Stonehenge.